Today we're going to be talking about the structure and properties of water. This is your first set of notes for your first unit, the chemistry of life and how chemistry and biology interact. Before we get started, I really want to get into this idea of living systems and how they interact. Biology is an extremely broad field. You could be a biologist that studies the interactions of proteins, or you could be a biologist that studies the interactions of different organisms in an ecosystem. But above all, what you should understand is that biology is organized into a hierarchical system. You have small and simple things located at the bottom, and as you go up, you get into the more complex and larger living systems that interact. Okay. And so what we're going to be focused on today is water, which is a molecule and it's considered non-living, and it is at the base of this hierarchy. But what you also have to understand is that water is essential in all of these levels, not just the molecular level. It's important at an organismal level when you have to think about how a plant transports water. It's essential at a biosphere level when we're understanding the water cycle. So just because it's in one level does not mean it doesn't interact and have a role in affecting the other levels in this hierarchy. Living systems rely so heavily on water that it's important for us to spend an entire set of notes talking about its properties. And so let's get into what exactly water is. Water is a molecule, and for those of you that remember any chemistry, you'll know that a molecule is any combination of two or more atoms that have been bound together, and that can be in an ionic or a covalent bond. And so you all know and are familiar with the molecular formula of water, which is H2O. And that tells us that water is a combination of the atoms hydrogen and oxygen. And now you may be thinking, well, how exactly do these two elements combine? Do they combine in a covalent bond or do they combine in an ionic bond? And an easy way you can remember how it might bind is by thinking about that metals and nonmetals, if they come together, that's going to form an ionic bond. And two nonmetals coming together is going to form a covalent bond. Now, for any of you guys that don't remember a whole lot of chemistry, the nonmetals are located on this right side of the periodic table. You have your metalloids that are located along the stair step, and basically everything else over here are considered metals. And so if you take something like sodium chloride, for instance, which is just regular old table salt, that consists of sodium, a metal, and chlorine, a nonmetal. And so sodium and chlorine form an ionic bond when they come together to form the molecule sodium chloride. And so now you may be looking at this periodic table and seeing where hydrogen and oxygen are located and think that oxygen might be formed by ionic bonds. But this is where you would actually assume wrong, because oxygen and hydrogen are both non-metals. And so that, by definition, means that they form covalent bonds with each other. And so you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, you just lied to me. You just told me that nonmetals are located here and metals are located all over here. But hydrogen is unique because it's located with the metals, but it is not metallic. In fact, there's only one reason that hydrogen is located over here with metals. And it has to do with the reason this entire periodic table was laid out the way it was. And it has to do with valence electrons. Now, for those of you that haven't had chemistry in a while, valence electrons are the number of electrons in the outermost orbital of an atom. And if you don't really remember what I'm talking about, maybe this picture will remind you. An atom's basic structure is one where you have a positive, dense nucleus full of protons and neutrons, and surrounding that nucleus, you have orbitals of electrons, electrons that are sort of floating and hanging around outside of that nucleus. And hydrogen, for example, is located in period 1, and the only other thing that's in period 1 with hydrogen is helium. And these guys have one orbital. And so in this first orbital, you are limited to 2 total electrons. And so in total, if you're in period 1, you can at most have 2 electrons in your valence shell. But if you're in groups 2 through 7, you can have up to 8. Hydrogen, because it's in group 1, that means that it has 1 valence electron. And that's the same as lithium, sodium, potassium, and all of these other alkali metals. Okay? And so from here, you can actually use the group number to figure out how many valence electrons all of the other elements have. So group 2 have 2 valence electrons. We're going to completely ignore all the transition metals because they're very weird. We're going to skip over to where boron is, and boron is in group 13. The 3 in the 13 should be a reminder that it has 3 valence electrons. Group 14 have 4 valence electrons. Group 15 have 5, and group 16, where oxygen is located, has 6 valence electrons. And so as a reminder, if you're in period 1, you want to have 2 valence electrons in order to be considered stable. And if you're in periods 2 through 7, you want to have 8 valence electrons in order to be stable. And so from here, you may be realizing that hydrogen and oxygen are in need of some electrons in order to have some stability. And so water, as we've just established, is a covalent compound. And what that means is that instead of giving up its electrons or somebody receiving electrons, electrons are going to be shared between the atoms. Now, as a reminder, hydrogen has 1 valence electron, but it wants 1 more in order to be considered stable. Oxygen has 6 valence electrons, which means it wants 2 in order to be stable. And also, as a reminder, the molecular formula of water, H2O, tells us that we have not 1, but 2 hydrogens to every 1 oxygen. And so if we lay out all of our atoms right here, we see our hydrogens each having their 1 electron and wanting 1 more, and our oxygen having 6 valence electrons and wanting 2 more. And so just like in the picture up at the right, these orbitals are going to start to overlap, and you're going to get a sharing of electrons that makes everyone happy. Everyone seem to be stable. Hydrogen now has, or at least thinks it has, 2 electrons, and the oxygen now thinks it has 8 electrons. But looking at this picture, do you notice anything about how the electrons are distributed? Specifically, is the sharing of the electrons in these bonds equal? And this is where we get into some very important characteristics about water's covalent bond. So we've already established that oxygen has more valence electrons than hydrogen. It's got 6, whereas hydrogen only has 1. And so another property of atoms that we need to think about, aside from their number of valence electrons, is their electronegativity. How attractive are they to electrons? Do they pull electrons close to their nucleus, or do they sort of keep them at arm's distance in their orbitals? And so we can look at electronegativity on the periodic table. And from this, we can see that fluorine, F, has a super high electronegativity compared to everything else. It loves electrons. It's what we would consider an electron hog. On the other hand, we have oxygen, which is the second most electronegative element in the periodic table, and it's very similar to fluorine in that it pulls electrons towards it. And so if we look at our water molecule that's composed of oxygens and hydrogens, and we compare the electronegativity of oxygens and hydrogens, what we can see is that oxygen is much more electronegative than hydrogen. And so why does that matter? Well, if we ignored electronegativity, what we would think about a water molecule looking like is this, in that you have an equal electron distribution, and things would be distributed evenly, so you wouldn't have any areas of high positive charge or high negative charge. But because oxygen likes to pull those electrons that hydrogen is sharing with it in the covalent bond, water molecules look a little bit more like this, where you have this unequal distribution of electrons, and that results in some unequal distribution of charge. Because as a reminder, electrons are negatively charged. And so this unequal distribution of electrons determines a property known as polarity. And so water being in a covalent bond with a highly electronegative element like oxygen is a highly polar molecule. And so we can look at this molecule and we notice there are poles or ends to this molecule. If you look near where the hydrogens are, you'll notice that it's slightly positive, and that's because its electrons are being pulled away from it, leaving just really the positive proton in the nucleus to provide that side of the molecule with charge. On the other hand, close to the oxygen, you have a high density, a high distribution of electrons, so you're going to have a slightly negative end. This is a lot like a magnet where you have a north and south end, but instead of having north and south, you're going to have a positive and negative end. And in the same way that opposites attract and the same things repel in a magnet, the same is true of these polar molecules with their positive and negative poles. So let's say you get a couple of water molecules together. The negative side of one water molecule is going to be attracted to the positive side of another water molecule. And this is going to create a very, very strong attraction that we call a hydrogen bond. Now, something I want to get out of the way before anybody gets confused is that hydrogen bonds are not true bonds. They're not the type of bonds that hold atoms together within a molecule. They're what we call intermolecular forces. And these are forces that hold water molecules together. And even though they're not real bonds, they are very strong forces, and they can take quite a bit of energy to overcome. And so the most important takeaway from this set of notes is that water's polarity, having a positive and a negative end, allows it to hydrogen bond. And this hydrogen bonding ability makes it essential to life and life's processes. And let me provide you some examples of this. So first things first, we have dew on the end of some pine needles of a pine tree. First thing you may notice is that water is beating up. This is a property of water known as cohesion. Water molecules stick to each other, and they stick to each other because of this hydrogen bonding. That means they have a high surface tension, and you guys have probably seen this with water bugs walking on top of a pond. Another thing, the water that you see on the end of these pine needles, it came from the roots of this pine tree, which means it had to travel from the roots up the trunk, down the stems, and into the needles. And water's ability to not only stick to itself, but to stick to other things, that's known as adhesion, is super essential to life, especially the survival of organisms like vascular plants. Another thing that makes water essential to life is the fact that solid water, ice, is less dense than liquid water. And that means that ice floats. And when ice floats on top of a body of liquid water, it insulates that liquid water, making that liquid water less likely to freeze. And that is important because that helps to regulate the amount of liquid water that is able to exist on the planet. That's why the ocean doesn't freeze through in the winter in certain places. Speaking of temperature, a lot of you probably have seen or know somebody or might even have yourself a pond like this in your backyard. And in the summertime when it's 100, 110 degrees, the water in your koi pond is not 100 or 110 degrees. In the wintertime when it gets into the 40s and 30s, the water is not in the 40s and 30s. And that's because it takes a lot of energy to turn water from liquid water into gaseous water, or even just to raise the temperature of water. And so water's ability to withstand big changes in temperature, whether it's getting hotter or getting colder, is a super important property that makes it possible for life to maintain some level of homeostasis. This also explains why certain cities around coastlines have pretty mild climates, because the water around those cities is able to absorb and release some of the heat that it can hold. Another property of water that you're probably familiar with is its um, universal solvent ability. Basically, water can dissolve most things. Because water has positive and negative ends, it can dissolve anything that is ionic and anything that is polar. And so that opens up a door to lots of different things that can exist in solution. The only things that can't be dissolved by water are nonpolar compounds, and we'll talk more about those later in the course. And the last little thing I want to touch on is the pH scale. And pH is a measure of how acidic or basic something is. Things that are highly acidic are lower on the pH scale, whereas things that are highly basic are higher up on the pH scale. And what you'll notice is that water is in the dead center. Water is so important because it serves as our neutral for our pH scale. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned a few things about the chemical properties of water, and we'll be getting into the properties of water that make it so important to life in class. Thanks.